Okay, so let me tell you about something that happened to me a few years ago that still makes me uneasy whenever I think about it. I've taken the train hundreds of times, but this one ride stuck with me, and not in a good way. It was late December, and I was heading back home after visiting some friends in a nearby city. I decided to take the train because it was cheaper and more convenient than driving, especially since the weather was supposed to get bad later that night. You know how those winter storms can be. One minute it's just cold, the next you're in a blizzard. So, I figured taking the train was the safest option. I'd caught the last train of the night, one of those older models that still had the creaky seats and dim lighting. It wasn't crowded. Most people had probably opted to stay home because of the weather. There were maybe a dozen or so people scattered throughout the cars, everyone bundled up in their winter gear, keeping to themselves. I found a seat near the back of the car, hoping to get some peace and quiet on the ride home. The train pulled out of the station, and I settled in, putting on my headphones and trying to relax. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks was almost soothing, and I figured I might even doze off for a bit. The car was dimly lit, with those old yellowish lights that give everything a kind of eerie glow. But I didn't mind. I was tired and just wanted to get home. About 20 minutes into the ride, I noticed something odd. The train seemed to be slowing down, but we weren't anywhere near a station. I looked out the window, but it was pitch black outside. No lights, no buildings, just darkness. I took off my headphones, trying to listen for any announcements, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the train gradually coming to a stop. I could feel the tension in the car as the other passengers started looking around, confused. We were in the middle of nowhere, and the train had just stopped without any explanation. After a few minutes, the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, saying something about a technical issue, and that we'd be moving again soon. It wasn't exactly reassuring, but what could we do? We were stuck. I tried to settle back in, telling myself it was just a minor delay, but something didn't feel right. The air in the car felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake this growing sense of unease. I looked around at the other passengers, and I could tell they were feeling it too. Everyone was on edge, glancing nervously at each other and out the windows, like we were all waiting for something to happen. After what felt like forever, the train finally started moving again, but it was different this time. The usual clack-clack of the wheels had changed, like something was off with the tracks or the train itself. The lights in the car flickered, dimming even more, and I could hear this strange humming noise, low and constant, that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old train acting up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing out the window, hoping to see some sign of where we were, but it was still pitch black outside. No lights, no landmarks, just an endless void of darkness. Then, out of nowhere, the train jerked violently, like it had hit something. People gasped, and a few even screamed as the car lurched to the side. I grabbed onto the armrest, trying to steady myself, and I heard someone behind me shout, "What the hell was that?" The train kept moving, but now it felt unsteady, like it was struggling to stay on the tracks. The humming noise had gotten louder, more intense, and I could feel it vibrating through the floor, making my whole body tense up. I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but everyone else looked just as scared and confused as I was. The train jerked again, and this time the lights flickered and went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound that eerie humming and the uneven clattering of the train. My heart was pounding, and I could hear people around me panicking, voices rising in fear. Suddenly, the train came to a screeching halt, throwing everyone forward in their seats. I heard a loud crash from somewhere up ahead, followed by the sound of glass shattering. People were shouting, trying to figure out what was going on, but no one had any answers. We were stuck, in the dark, in the middle of nowhere. For what felt like an eternity, we just sat there, listening to the sound of the wind howling outside, and the occasional creak of the train settling on the tracks. I was gripping the armrest so hard my knuckles were white, and I could feel sweat trickling down the back of my neck despite the cold. Then, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine, a soft scraping sound, like something was dragging along the outside of the train. It started at the front of the car and slowly made its way toward the back, getting louder as it went. I held my breath, straining to listen, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The scraping stopped right outside my window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I turned my head, squinting into the pitch black void, and for a second I thought I saw something. A shadow, maybe, or a faint outline of a figure, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning whether I'd seen anything at all. I wasn't the only one who heard it. I could tell from the hushed whispers and the tense atmosphere in the car that everyone else had heard it too. People were on edge, some even standing up to look around, but no one seemed to know what to do. After a few more minutes, the lights flickered back on, dim and sputtering, but enough to see by. The conductor's voice came over the intercom again, sounding shaky as he apologized for the delay and said we'd be moving shortly. But his voice didn't inspire much confidence. It was like he was just as freaked out as we were. The train started moving again, slowly at first, but then it picked up speed. The humming noise was still there, but it was quieter now, almost drowned out by the sound of the wheels on the tracks. I tried to relax, but I couldn't stop thinking about that scraping sound, and whatever it was I thought I'd seen outside the window. We rode in silence for the next half hour, everyone too scared or too tired to talk. The train seemed to be running smoothly again, but the tension in the car was palpable. I kept glancing out the window, but it was still too dark to see anything. Finally, we started to see lights in the distance. A station, thank God. The train slowed down, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me. We were almost there, almost safe. But just as we were pulling into the station, the train jerked violently again, and the lights flickered and went out for a second time. People screamed, and I heard someone shout, "Get off the train!" But before anyone could move, the train came to a screeching halt, throwing us all forward in our seats again. The lights flickered back on, but this time they were dimmer, barely illuminating the car. I looked around, trying to figure out what had happened, but it was chaos. People were panicking, scrambling to grab their things and get off the train. I was about to do the same when I heard that scraping sound again, this time coming from the roof of the train. It was louder now, more frantic, like something was trying to claw its way inside. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. Whatever was making that noise, it wasn't something I wanted to meet. The train doors finally opened, and people started rushing out, pushing and shoving in their desperation to get off. I grabbed my bag and followed, my legs feeling like jelly as I stumbled toward the door. The scraping sound was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else. This low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. I didn't look back. I just ran, pushing through the crowd and onto the platform. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I just needed to get as far away from that train as possible. Once I was off the train, I looked back, half expecting to see something crawling out of the shadows, but there was nothing, just the old train sitting there, the doors open and the lights flickering weakly inside. The station was nearly deserted, just a few other passengers standing around, looking as shaken as I felt. I didn't stick around to find out what had happened. I just made a beeline for the exit, my heart still pounding in my chest. I don't know what it was that night, and honestly, I don't want to know. Maybe it was just an old train acting up, or maybe it was something else, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Whatever it was, I haven't taken that train route since, and I don't plan on doing it anytime soon. So yeah, that's my story. It's not the kind of thing you forget easily, and even now, I still get uneasy whenever I hear that faint scraping sound, like something is dragging itself along the outside of the train. It's a reminder that sometimes there are things out there that we can't explain, things that we'd rather not think about, but they're there all the same, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Alright, here's a story that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. It happened a few years ago when I was taking a train home from visiting some friends. I've taken trains plenty of times before, but this one ride is something I won't forget anytime soon. It was late autumn, and I was visiting some college friends who lived in a small town a couple of hours away by train. We had a great weekend, just hanging out, catching up, nothing too wild. But by the time I was heading back, the weather had started to turn. You know the kind. Gray skies, the kind of cold that cuts right through your jacket, and just a general feeling of gloom. It was the last train of the day, leaving just after 8 p.m., and I was the only one heading back that night. The station was pretty empty when I got there, just a few other people scattered around, most of them looking just as tired and ready to get home as I was. The train rolled in right on time. one of those older models with the slightly worn out seats and that faint smell of stale air that all trains seem to have. I didn't think much of it, just another routine ride. I found a seat near the middle of the car, not too close to the doors, but not too far from them either. There were maybe 10 or so other people in the car with me, all spread out, keeping to themselves. I put my backpack on the seat next to me, settled in, and pulled out my phone, figuring I'd just listen to some music and maybe doze off for a bit. The train started moving, and everything seemed fine at first. The gentle rocking of the train, the low hum of the engine, and the occasional announcements over the intercom. Everything was just like it always was. I stared out the window as the city lights faded into the distance, replaced by the dark shapes of trees and fields as we moved further out into the countryside. About half an hour into the ride, I noticed something strange. The train was slowing down, but we weren't anywhere near a station. I glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed, but everyone seemed to be minding their own business. I figured it was probably nothing, maybe just a signal delay or something. But then the train came to a complete stop. Just like that, we were sitting in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness. The only light was coming from the dim overhead bulbs in the car, which cast this eerie yellow glow over everything. It was quiet, too quiet, and I started to feel that weird prickling sensation on the back of my neck. You know, the one that tells you something's not right. There was no announcement, no explanation for why we'd stopped. People started to stir, looking around with confused expressions, but no one said anything. We all just sat there, waiting for the train to start moving again. But it didn't. Minutes passed, and the tension in the car was starting to build. I could feel it, this unspoken unease that was creeping over everyone. Finally, the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, saying something about a technical issue, and that we'd be moving again shortly. His voice was calm, but there was something in his tone that didn't sit right with me. It was like he was trying too hard to sound reassuring, and it only made me more nervous. The train stayed still for another 10 minutes or so, and during that time, I started noticing more things that were off. The lights were flickering occasionally, just small, almost imperceptible flickers, but enough to make me notice. And there was this low hum that seemed to vibrate through the floor of the train. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, almost like it was coming from the tracks themselves. Finally, the train lurched back into motion, but something was different. The usual smooth ride felt jerky, uneven, like the train was struggling to stay on the tracks. The humming noise got louder, more pronounced, and it felt like it was reverberating through my bones. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just an old train on old tracks. Nothing to worry about. But then something happened that I couldn't ignore. We were passing through a particularly dark stretch of countryside when the lights inside the car suddenly went out, plunging us into complete darkness. There were a few startled gasps, and I could hear someone nearby muttering a curse under their breath. I reached for my phone, using the screen to give me a bit of light, and I noticed other people doing the same. For a few long seconds, it was pitch black, the only sounds being the rattling of the train and that persistent humming. Then the lights flickered back on, but they were dimmer than before, casting long, deep shadows across the car. Everyone was looking around, wide-eyed, and I could feel the tension ratchet up even more. Just as I was starting to think we were in the clear, the train jerked violently, like it had hit something. People were thrown forward in their seats, and I heard the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor in the next car. The train kept moving, but now it felt like it was struggling, swaying more than it should have been. That was when the panic started to set in. You could see it on everyone's faces, this realization that something was seriously wrong. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing, and I could feel sweat starting to bead on my forehead. I kept glancing out the window, hoping to see lights from a town or station, anything that would indicate we were close to help. But there was nothing, just an endless stretch of darkness on either side. Then the train started slowing down again, and the humming noise grew louder, almost like it was coming from right underneath us. The train came to another halt, and this time the conductor's voice didn't come over the intercom. We were just stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no idea what was going on. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something was dragging along the side of the train. It was soft at first, almost like the sound of branches brushing against the metal, but it gradually grew louder. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I noticed that everyone else had gone completely still, their eyes wide with fear. The scraping moved from one end of the car to the other, then back again, like something was circling us, searching for a way in. I could hear people whispering nervously, trying to figure out what it was, but no one had any answers. I didn't want to look out the window, but I couldn't help myself. I leaned over and peered into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Just the reflection of the dimly lit car and my own pale face staring back at me. The scraping continued for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The train sat in silence, the only sound that low hum that seemed to be getting louder by the second. I was gripping the armrest so hard my knuckles were white, and I could hear my own breathing, loud and shaky. Finally, after what felt like hours, the train started moving again, but it was slow, like it was barely managing to inch forward. The lights flickered on and off, casting everything in this surreal, strobe-like effect. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes, and I knew they were thinking the same thing I was. What the hell was going on? We crawled along for another few minutes, and then, out of nowhere, the train picked up speed. It wasn't smooth, more like a sudden jolt, like someone had flipped a switch. The humming noise was still there, vibrating through the floor, but it was overshadowed by the sound of the wheels clattering on the tracks. We passed through a few more dark stretches, and I kept waiting for something else to happen, for the lights to go out again, or for that scraping noise to return, but nothing did. Eventually, we started to see the faint glow of lights in the distance, and I realized we were approaching a station. The train pulled in, and the doors opened, but no one moved. It was like we were all in shock, trying to process what had just happened. The conductor's voice finally came over the intercom, telling us this was the last stop, and that everyone needed to get off. His voice sounded strained, like he was barely holding it together. I grabbed my bag and stood up on shaky legs, following the other passengers out onto the platform. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was getting as far away from that train as possible. As I walked away, I glanced back at the train, half expecting to see something, anything, that could explain what had happened. But there was nothing, just the old train sitting there, looking as normal as ever. The lights inside were flickering, but that was the only sign that anything had been wrong. I didn't wait around. I headed straight for the exit, my heart still pounding, and I didn't stop until I was out of the station and on my way home. It wasn't until I was safely inside my apartment, with the door locked behind me, that I finally let myself breathe. I've taken trains since then, but I always get a little nervous whenever we pass through a dark stretch or the lights flicker. It's that same feeling, that something could go wrong at any moment, that keeps me on edge. I don't know what happened that night, and maybe I never will, but it's one of those experiences that makes you realize how small and vulnerable you can feel, even in something as ordinary as a train ride. It happened a few years ago when I was taking a late-night train home after visiting a friend. It wasn't anything dramatic, but it was one of those experiences that just doesn't sit right with you, no matter how much time has passed. So, it was a cold winter night, and I was heading back home after spending the weekend with an old friend. We'd had a good time, just catching up and relaxing, but by the time I left, it was already dark and freezing outside. I had to catch the last train of the night to get back home, and I remember thinking how quiet and empty the station was when I got there. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. The train pulled in right on time, and when I got on, there weren't many people. Maybe a handful of other passengers, all spread out in the different cars, probably just as eager to get home as I was. I found a seat near the middle of the car, put my backpack on the seat next to me, and settled in for the ride. I figured I'd just listen to some music and maybe doze off for a bit. The train started moving, and everything was normal at first. The rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks, the dim lights flickering overhead, and the occasional announcement from the conductor. I was tired, so I leaned back and closed my eyes, trying to relax. But about 20 minutes into the ride, I noticed something strange. The train started slowing down, which wouldn't have been weird if we were approaching a station, but we were in the middle of nowhere. I looked out the window, but all I could see was darkness. No lights, no buildings, just the faint outline of trees against the night sky. The train came to a complete stop, and for a minute, no one moved. The lights flickered a bit, and I could feel this tension start to build in the car. I wasn't the only one who noticed it. People were starting to look around, confused, but no one said anything. We were all just sitting there, waiting for some kind of explanation. Finally, the conductor's voice came over the intercom, saying something about a minor technical issue, and that we'd be moving again shortly. His voice was calm, but it didn't do much to ease the tension. It was one of those situations where you know something's wrong, but you're trying to convince yourself it's not a big deal. We sat there for what felt like forever, and the longer we waited, the more anxious I became. There was this low humming noise coming from the floor of the train, something I hadn't noticed before, and it was making me feel on edge. It wasn't loud, just this constant vibrating hum that seemed to get under your skin the longer you listened to it. After a few more minutes, the train finally started moving again, but it was different. The ride was rougher, like the train was struggling to stay on the tracks. The lights flickered more frequently, casting strange shadows on the walls, and the humming noise seemed to get louder, almost like it was coming from right beneath my feet. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just an old train on old tracks, but something didn't feel right. I kept looking around, trying to see if anyone else was feeling the same way, but most people were just staring straight ahead, probably trying to convince themselves everything was fine. But then something happened that I couldn't ignore. The train suddenly jerked violently, like it had hit something, and people were thrown forward in their seats. There were a few gasps, and someone behind me cursed under their breath. The train kept moving, but now it felt like it was barely holding together, swaying side to side with every bump on the tracks. And then the lights went out. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound that eerie humming and the clattering of the train. I could feel my heart start to race, and I gripped the armrest, trying to stay calm. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, and I noticed a few other people doing the same. The dim beams of light cut through the darkness, but it wasn't enough to see much of anything. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something was dragging along the outside of the train. It started near the front of the car and slowly made its way toward the back. This slow, deliberate sound that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't see anything outside the window, just my own reflection staring back at me, but I knew something was out there. The scraping stopped just outside my window, and I held my breath, trying to listen for any other sounds. But there was nothing, just the sound of the train clattering along the tracks, and that low hum that seemed to be growing louder by the second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lights flickered back on, but they were dimmer than before, barely illuminating the car. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom again, telling us that we were approaching the next station and that everyone should prepare to get off. His voice sounded strained, like he was barely keeping it together. The train pulled into the station and the doors opened, but no one moved at first. It was like we were all too stunned to react. But then, one by one, people started grabbing their bags and heading for the doors, moving quickly but quietly, like they didn't want to draw any more attention to themselves. I grabbed my backpack and followed, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The platform was cold and empty, and as I stepped off the train, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I looked back at the train, half expecting to see something or someone staring back at me from one of the windows, but there was nothing, just the dimly lit train sitting there, looking as normal as ever. I didn't stick around to find out what had happened. I headed straight for the exit, my heart still pounding in my chest, and I didn't stop until I was safely outside the station. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was like a weight on my chest, this lingering sense of dread that I couldn't explain. I've taken trains since then, but I always get a little nervous whenever we pass through a dark stretch or the lights flicker. It's that same feeling that something could go wrong at any moment that keeps me on edge. I don't know what happened that night, and maybe I never will, but it's one of those experiences that makes you realize how small and vulnerable you can feel, even in something as ordinary as a train ride. So, yeah, that's my story. It might not sound like much, but it's stuck with me. And every time I think about it, I can't help but wonder what really happened that night on the train.